It's July 19th, 2016, and we're here with Judge Ron Ellis, who has graciously agreed to be interviewed or was forced into being interviewed by his friends. So tell us, just state your name, as they say, and tell us your district and when you were appointed.
Ronald L. Ellis, I like to use my L. I was appointed November 16, 1993 in the Southern District of New York.
Wow, all right. And are you still active? What's your status right this minute?
I am still active, and my third term ends November of next year, so I'll have 24 years in 2017.
Wow, and what are you going to do then?
I'm not sure. It's actually possible I may actually see if I could retire and get recalled. It's such a great job.
It is a great job,
Yes.
don't you think?
I think it's, my former job, I worked for the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, and I used to think that I could never get a better job, and so my thought is that I now have one A and one B. So I think I could never have imagined how great a job it really is.
So tell me a little bit about where you grew up and what your background was as a kid.
Okay. I was born in a small bayou crossing in Louisiana, a place called Lafourche, Louisiana. My father was what they call a common laborer, and my mother did housework. Mostly in Louisiana where I was, it was sugarcane fields. My father left the family to come up to New York because he wanted some opportunities for the family. Because in the job he was, if you were an African American, you could never be anything but a common laborer. And so he wanted his children to have some opportunities, and so in a sort of the fashion, he came up by himself, and then my mother and the smaller children followed, and me and my older brother came up alone, which was an adventure in and of itself. I was 11 at the time, and we were in the back of a Greyhound bus coming up through the South and up to Washington, D.C., and we didn't actually know what segregation was, and my brother says I made a few faux pas because I got on the wrong lines when we got out of the bus. Ironically, I guess that was when the Freedom Riders were going in the other direction. We were coming up north. But
so what year was that?
62.
Okay.
And my parents believed in education, and one of the things that we were actually in parochial schools, Catholic schools, some people call them, and we had been in those schools in Louisiana, and we had missionary nuns who were our teachers, segregated schools. We moved up to Harlem, again segregated schools, but Catholic schools, and they were mostly insistent that we stay in school.
So how far in advance did your dad go, ahead of the family?
I think, when you're 11 years old, details
Right.
are not that great for you. I know he went the year before, so at least 6 months he was up there before anybody else came to join him.
So you were born in 1950?
Yes.
Okay. All right. And then your mom and your two younger siblings went?
There were actually three younger ones. And actually my sister would have been under 2. She was the baby. We had 4 boys and then a baby girl.
The princess?
That about describes how she was treated. And so the 3 younger ones came up, and then my older brother and we came up.
So who did you stay with?
My mother's sister.
Okay.
I think our coming up was a combination of my mother missing us and her sister thinking that we probably missed our mom.
That was a good time to move.
Yes.
So parochial schools were segregated both in Louisiana and in New York at that time?
Well, by law in the South. I
Right.
mean, this was 62, but and so although it was post-Brown, you know, we were
Yeah.
bused to black schools, and so the busing wasn't the issue. Was, you know, schools were, it was just segregated, and I don't think the idea of Brown even entered into anybody's discussions where we were, and so, you know, and then we moved to Harlem, and Harlem, by housing patterns or otherwise, it was segregated, and so there were there were only black students in my classes.
So you still were in Catholic school when you got to New York, or when you went to New York?
Yes.
So you would have been about, what, 6th grade then? 5th
Yes.
grade? Okay.
Yes. The biggest thing that happened is when we moved up, they wanted to put us all a grade behind because they didn't think education in the South was up to standards, and my mother insisted that we be put in our own grades, so that because she said my kids will be able to handle it, and if they can't, then we'll deal with it.
So your parents had a pretty clear idea what they wanted for you and what sacrifices they were willing to make to get that happen, right?
My father worked so many jobs that you know, and I think when he finally got to work for the United States Postal Service, that was when I think he cut down to 2 jobs.
Wow.
But he had many jobs because one job wasn't nearly enough, and although the numbers might not be that great now, you know, we were in private school.
Yes.
You know, I remember when they wanted to raise the tuition from $15 a month to $20 a month, and that was a big hardship. So,
Well, it was, and you had 5 kids,
Yeah.
and plus you came from Louisiana to snow, so there was another adjustment, right?
Yes.
And everybody needed boots.
you had to get new clothes and winter clothes and boots.
And so did you have family in New York, or did your dad just set out and say, I'm going to make this work?
Well, there were family members in New York. I mean, and not a large portion of them, but they're members of our family in different parts in the North. They're part of that diaspora where, but New York seemed to be the place that he set his sights on. And I think basically the idea was when he got a place himself, because when he moved up, he would stay with somebody, he
Right.
would work, and then when he accumulated money, he got us an apartment.
So where do you remember your address from then? When
From
you lived-
Louisiana?
No, from in Harlem.
I do.
Okay, what was it?
It was 2061 8th Avenue. I remember my address in Louisiana also.
All right, what was that?
621 Maple Street in Thibodaux, Louisiana. We moved to the big city when I was an infant. Thibodaux was a
Thibodaux,
parish
right.
seat. And yeah, so now where I grew up, it used to be a 5-floor walk-up tenement. It's now a different kind of place. It's upscale.
I was going to say luxury condos probably,
Yes,
right?
It's got a bank on the first floor.
Oh, my.
When I was there, it had a a diner, not a diner. A diner would have been an upscale, but it was.
Yeah, I know, a counter service kind of
Yes.
thing, yeah.
Greasy.
Well, that goes without saying, yeah. So how far away was school? Like, so
Well, when for grade school, it was only about 6 blocks.
okay.
So and so it wasn't that big a trek to school.
So are you the oldest or
I'm the
the
second.
next? Okay.
Yes.
So how did you decide like where you wanted to go to college, that you wanted to go to college? Because what year would you have graduated from high school?
1968. It was
So
a very,
that started Vietnam.
that was a tumultuous year.
Yeah,
We had the King assassination.
right.
We had the Kennedy assassination. It was, you know, teenager during that period of time. A lot of activism and people were concerned about draft.
Very much so. I mean, very much. And a lot of shifting society and shifting roles and people kind of sorting themselves out in terms of, you know, what you wanted or what was right, and what the government could do. So there you are at 18, and what are you doing at that moment?
Well, college was basically a foregone conclusion, although my parents weren't into any particular names. They were just happy that we were going to college. And my brother, my older brother's first college graduate in our family, he went on to be a doctor, so I guess that worked out. But you know, I was trying to figure out what kind of things I would do in college, and I was good in math and science. And so I was looking, I decided I wanted to be an engineer, or at least I would go to engineering school. I can't say that I was ever really interested in being an engineer, but I liked the discipline of engineering, and I also liked the idea that it was not subjective.
Right, there was an answer.
There was an answer, and if you got it right, nobody could say that wasn't a great essay or we didn't like your style. Mm-hmm. And so I decided I would go to engineering school, and trying to figure out what school to go to. And I actually went to the same high school as Sonia Sotomayor. And I finished at the top of my class, and originally I was thinking of going to Harvard, and so I got Harvard, MIT, but then I went to Manhattan College, which was a great engineering school, and also had the benefit of giving me a full scholarship.
Oh, we like this school. All right.
Yes. And so my practical mind said that sounded good, and I guess my confident self said I could go to whatever school I want and I could still be successful. So I had the idea. So I had the opportunity to turn down Harvard. So I always think that's a good idea. Coincidentally, I had a similar choice when I went to law school and did a similar thing. But you know, I was thinking of getting an engineering degree, and
well, I'm still trying to figure out how the linear thinking of engineers, where you want a bright line answer, flips into law school. So did you finish your engineering degree? I
finished my engineering degree, chemical engineering. I think it was more that I have an orderly, logical mind more than anything else, and I think there was a sort of a comfort level in doing that. I didn't practice as an engineer. I really decided I wanted to go to law school, although that was more of the idea of being a young person, think you're going to change the world kind of thing. I really thought I was going to be a criminal defense attorney, because it's sort of that Perry Masonage kind of thing. You have innocent people, you get them off.
But think about it. So you're in college, and you don't come from a family of lawyers. And, you know, I mean, my dad was a carpenter. And when someone asked me, you know, do you want to go to law school? I mean, I said, my dad's not a lawyer. I mean, it didn't occur to me as a career choice. So what opened that gate for you, or what made you think about law school? Well,
if you're an African American and you do well academically, there are people who will make choices for you. In the Catholic school system, they were very, very much pushing me to do things. In fact, I think they were disappointed I didn't go to Harvard. But you know, the aspiration to do something useful, they would put those ideas in your mind because they believed in education also.
But being a chemical engineer is pretty useful. But you don't just say, okay, I'm done with this, now I'll move on to law. So what happened that made you think, I'd like another degree?
Well, I think if you grow up African American in this country and you see the injustices, you know, there's your academic side and then there's your personal side, and you see people in your community. I mean, I had a community that was ravaged by drugs. I mean, you know, there were people who were, you know, laying in the vestibule of your apartment building, and when you're young, you're very idealistic, and you start to think of ways that you can change the world. And some of the organizations I belonged to in high school were organizations that were always outer directed, and so that sense of trying to do something that had a broader impact stayed with me. And while engineering is a good job, and in fact the one thing about engineering is you could come out of engineering school, you were some of the best paid people. Mm-hmm. But I think I came to the realization that my personality did not fit in with most of the people I met in engineering school.
And I think you're right.
And so, you know, I took a course in American legal history and that kind of thing, and it just, you know, it just seemed that law and reading about, I was reading about some of the civil rights cases, and you know, it seemed like, you know, this is the kind of impact that I would like to have, where, you know, you can change people's lives, and recognizing the kinds of things that my father had wanted to change, and how he was very good mechanically speaking, and could never get a job that used his talents, and so the idea that you could do that and get people's lives and transform them, I started to appeal to me. And as I said, you know, you're 18, now you're 22, and you know, the war, and you had a high number in the draft, so everything was good, and you got the payback. So I think law seemed to be the way to go.
So did you go to law school right out of college?
I did. There was nothing in between college. I finished college a little early, but I didn't do anything. I didn't do anything. I had a job as a computer programmer, and so I did that for I think 6 months between the end of college and law school, and I also was planning my wedding because I got married very young.
All right. So where did you meet your wife?
I met. She was at a school in Westchester, and she had come down to a party at Manhattan College. So just reinforced the idea that Manhattan College was the right decision for me. Huh. So, yeah, so we met at a campus thing.
All right. And so did she graduate from the college she came down from?
She did. Hers was a junior college, and then she went to Pratt, and she got a library science degree, and she, I guess, 40 years as a librarian.
Wow.
And her last job was at an independent school in Brooklyn, and so. So
you've stayed pretty geographically bound in the same location, haven't you?
I have.
Yeah.
I have, unlike my brother, who has messed up my phone book, I think one of the things about me and my wife, I think that makes us compatible, is that we've been in the same house now for 30 years. I've had 2 jobs, one has been 17 years, one has been 24 years. I tend to be long-term with the things that I select, so. And
she's glad of that. All right, so what law schools did you apply to, or who did you turn down from law schools?
I applied, the only ones I remember are Harvard and NYU, because as it turns out, I accepted Harvard, and but I'd gotten what at NYU something called a Ruth Tilden Scholarship, which was a tuition scholarship, and I went after I'd selected Harvard. I went back to the Ruth Tilden people and asked them, could I change my mind, because I went up to Harvard to ask them about financial aid, and it didn't seem to work out well. And so they said sure, because they were trying to build the school into a national school. and they were actually trying to get people who would otherwise go to schools like Harvard or Yale, and so I was in the program, and that's how I wound up at NYU.
So what year did you start?
72.
And what year did you finish?
75.
75. And so did you think you made a good choice, as much as anyone does who's in law school?
Well, making a good choice depends on where you end up. And one of the things I was able to do when because I was at NYU, is that the Root Tilden program required us to do an intern during the school year. And I went to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and said, can I do this during the school year? And they said, sure. And so after my first year, and then during my second year, I did interning at the Legal Defense Fund, and that's how I was on their radar when the vacancy came up that I took and held for 17 years.
Well, how about that? So, well, that's a little different trajectory than most kids today have. So, you're at Legal Defense Fund doing things. And what were you doing? Were you litigating? Were you shaping policy?
I was litigating. I mainly did employment class actions. I did a little bit of voting rights, some school cases. But for the first part of my tenure, I did mostly class actions. At some point, I was director of that national program, and then I changed 3 years later, and we had a program called Poverty and Justice, and I took over that for a while. Sort of the idea that poverty and justice were really related. I think the most interesting thing that happened is that while I was doing the employment cases, I ran into a lot of people who were like my father, because a lot of cases we brought were people who were stuck in black jobs and could not get out of those jobs. And so we were bringing class actions in which we would challenge those practices, allow people to move in to jobs that had better lines of progression and better opportunities to move up and better income. So that impact litigation where you can have as many as 2,000 people, that was exciting.
Did you target specific industries, or did you have plaintiffs come to you and then you started to maybe cluster along a line? Or what, how did you find that case or those cases and decide, okay, here's where we're going to put our energy?
Well, it was a combination of different things. One of the things that the Legal Defense Fund did, which I think was a great strategy, is they would train young lawyers around the country, and they had this cadre of what they call cooperating attorneys, and those attorneys would bring us cases. They were lawyers who were either trained directly by LDF, who'd come up to New York and did an internship, or who were given support by LDF in their local state. And so that combined with a community, we had a community segment at LDF, and we'd find people and plaintiffs and people were complaining about things. Putting all those things together, you would come up with, well, what does the community want? What kinds of areas have impact? What kinds of jobs would people like to have? And so we would get cases that way and then find plaintiffs who were willing to challenge those practices.
So was that a national practice, or were you primarily filing in New York, or you would file wherever it made sense?
It was basically below the Mason-Dixon line. What would have comprised the Confederate states. I think I may have had a case in every one of those states, from Texas all the way to Virginia and West Virginia, Mississippi, Alabama, in between. So it involved a lot of travel, actually.
So I was just going to ask, were you appearing or with local counsel?
With local counsel.
Okay.
What tended to be the model is we would work through local counsel, and the LDF person would be like advisor in a war, and what kinds of things do you need to win this war, and pull the resources together, map out the strategy, make sure that everybody understands what you need to prove in a large class action context to prevail. And so while I didn't learn actually how to file a complaint in court because I had local people, I did look at the broader pictures.
So were you ever afraid?
The short answer is yes, although I realized that my fear was disproportionate to what had happened to some of the people who went before me. But you grow up in a safe environment, and you land in a small town in the South, and they close the airport, and you're out there on a country road by yourself, waiting for somebody to pick you up, and they don't show up, and that happened to me. It turns out that many of our cases were in places that were not big cities,
Right.
and they were places that had signs openly proclaiming Klan territory. I don't think I ever had sort of a visceral fear, more apprehension than anything, but except for that one instance when I was lost on that dirt road.
Well, and it's hard. And was your wife afraid for you to take on this travel and to go down there and be the face of, LDF?
I think she was probably more afraid than I was. When you're in a situation, you know what's happening, and so if I don't contact her, which happened on that time when I was on that road, and
This is before cell phones.
yes, and so when you're home and you're sitting and waiting, and you have no idea, like no cell phones, nobody to contact, because there was nobody to call.
Right.
And so I think she was always a little apprehensive, and but not in a way to say, well, you shouldn't be doing it. I think she thought
Right.
it was important work, and I think she was glad I was doing it. Just that it was difficult when I was away.
Right. And so you get this internship, and then you get a job, and you stay for almost 2 decades. So during this time, were you thinking about, I'd like to apply for some judgeships, or I'd like to maybe concentrate a little bit more, or stay at home, or what made you gravitate toward applying for? Had you applied for state judgeships?
No, actually, I had thought about being a judge because people would. My temperament is actually such that I'm a mediator. If there's a problem in the family or in the workplace, I'm sort of the voice of reason. People used to say, to be a judge. The problem is that the only experience that I had with what had happened to people going through Congress were not very good experiences. There are people from LDF who had sought executive level jobs, and they were turned down. We had some local attorneys who couldn't get Article III positions because what people considered to be unacceptable was right up my litigation strategy. And so it wasn't until I found out that magistrate judges didn't go through Congress. I really didn't know. I'd practiced before magistrates. And so in the time between the enhanced powers and the change,
Right.
I had not had much experience. Then I found out that there was this new
Merit
judge.
selection, right.
And it said merit selection. I said, well, okay, I'm willing to try merit selection. And so there's a vacancy in Manhattan and also one in Brooklyn. I applied to both of them.
All right. Was it the same committee screening?
No,
for
two
both?
different committees.
2 different committees. All right. Because, they'd be different districts and the judges would be appointing. So what year was that? Do you remember?
That was in 1993.
So both vacancies, and then what happened?
Well, I applied to the Manhattan one first, and I went through and I got recommended, got interviewed by the Board of Judges, and then I got a call from the Brooklyn people saying, if you get the Manhattan job, would you take it? So I said,
Probably.
I said yes. I was living, notwithstanding I was living in Brooklyn, I said yes, I'd take the Manhattan job. And so I think when the call came, I said, this seems like, how could you do better than that?
Right.
I didn't, as it turns out, I didn't really know that much about Brooklyn, the federal court system. I'd been in the Manhattan court system, federal court system a couple of times, and some of the judges there I thought were excellent, and I said, this looks like a good group to join.
And there you are. So who did your training when you started in '93? Was that still Dolly Madison House, or was FJC still, or had we started to do they'd send a box of tapes somewhere and you went somewhere for your new judge training?
I remember going to DC for some judge training, and in fact, I actually went before I started. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what makes it a little fuzzy, because when you get materials before you start, they're out of context.
Yeah.
And so it's case management. I didn't know what case management was. It's not the same as when you're in practice.
Initial appearances, right? So,
but it was tapes, and I looked at the videotapes actually.
Right. All right, and then how many judges were in your court when you started? Do you remember?
It must be about the same as it is now. I think we had 27 in.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
Yes.
And what kind of caseload? What's been the difference in the types of cases from when you started until now?
Well, the one thing about the way we're utilized in the Southern District is that whenever a case is filed, it gets both a magistrate judge and a district judge, and so we get all the kinds of cases. We had a lot more employment cases, as Title VII kind of employment cases to begin with. We have more Fair Labor Standards cases now. We get more Social Security cases now. We have a steady diet of Section 1983 cases. And I think the intellectual property cases are going up now. I guess, I don't know whether that's an economic issue or just that people are just becoming more aware of their rights and there's more publicity about them.
I think one thing that I've seen change is certainly the use of private dispute resolution services, and so things that we used to try on a fairly regular basis, like employment or some transactional things, are now gone. I mean, we don't see them, or they don't go to trial as much anymore. How's the consent docket been?
It could be better. I think we lag a little on the consent side. We're getting, I think we get a lot of the problem general pretrial cases.
Yeah.
And I say problem because a district judge will call and say, I can't take these people anymore. But I think what's been great though is for the law clerks, because the smooth cases are not as good for learning as the problem cases, but the consents, I think it's difficult to get consent because there's a lot of inertia in the bar. They don't want to make a decision and then have it go wrong. So I think whenever the lawyers have to make a decision, they're very hesitant.
Well, and they claim it's client-driven, but they don't necessarily want to educate the client. And if the district judges aren't supportive of the consent or encouraging the consent, I think there's some bar folklore about you don't want to consent off the district judge's calendar because they'll be irritated, and I don't think district judges look at it that closely that they know.
Well, and there's actually a difference between the Southern District in Manhattan and the Southern District in Westchester, because in Westchester, consents are part of the culture there. which is an interesting dynamic because lawyers who are in Westchester or a case in Manhattan have a different sensibility.
So what do you think has been like the biggest challenge and then the biggest, I guess, pleasure about being a magistrate judge? You know, what do you wish someone would have told you before you took the job, and what would you tell the next generation of judge coming along?
You know, one question that I'm often asked is because when you've been an advocate, people say, how can you go from being an advocate to being a judge? Isn't that such a traumatic change? And what I tell them is we weren't as results oriented as people think. What we were about access to justice. And we had clients who were happy to be telling their stories. The first time anybody had ever listened to them, and certainly in something as august as a federal court, to tell their story about how they've been oppressed and how they were voiceless and nameless and how they were victimized by so many systems in our society. And so I see the transition to judge as being trying to accomplish the same thing, making sure everybody has their voice. Everybody gets a fair opportunity to present their case, and then let the facts and the law determine what's going to happen. And so as a magistrate judge, because many cases don't get to trial, sometimes the best thing that you get out of the case is each side gets to find out what's going on, that discovery process. And so when that happens, you get a much better result in the resolution of the case, even without a trial, because everybody has a better sense of what really is happening. People often come to litigation and they have no idea what's happening on the other side. And you can bring to that process a credibility because nobody ever believes the other side. And so that's what I see part of my role as. And when it happened probably enough so that I think it keeps me going, is that people will say, you know, if it hadn't been for you, we would never have resolved this case. Mm-hmm. And I think there's probably nothing better you can say to a judge. I mean, even better than saying you wrote this really nice opinion. Right. It's like people want their disputes resolved. They don't want to spend 2 years to have some decision. They have a dispute, they want it resolved, and they want it resolved in a way that they feel have been treated fairly. And I think if you do nothing else as a judge to make people feel that they've been treated fairly in a federal court, you've done your job. Mm-hmm. And so I find it's gratifying when people, both sides come out and they're just happy. And you know, unlike some people say everybody's unhappy, I actually have people who are happy. And I had one settlement, for example, where the person didn't really want to settle the case, and then I was talking to them about how long it would take, and you might not recover as much. So we worked out a settlement. They used the money on the settlement, and they went to law school, and they actually graduated.
Well, that's nice. And did they? How did you know that? Did they keep in touch, or did they tell you, or?
Actually, one of the things that I do is the incoming class for the City University of New York Law School. For the last 15 or so years, I talk to the incoming class about being lawyers and public service. And I'm at the end of the talk, someone came up to me and they says, you don't remember me, but, and so then they told me their story, and I said, well, that's a good outcome.
That is good. And I think that is one of the reasons a lot of us like the job, is because we have a lot more public contact and lawyer contact than some of the district judges who just are into case processing. And I guess what roles have you had in the Federal Magistrate Judges Association?
Sadly, except for coming to the conferences, if there's something that I'm not very good at, it's committees, and most people recognize that I have that. I think my rationalization for it is that as evidenced by the fact that I stay with things a long time, when I do things, it sort of it becomes overwhelming to me, and I can't do things halfway, and I have so many things that I'm trying to do that and then of course there always seem to be good people willing to do it.
I'm happy to get out of the way and let other people do it. That's okay. That works for me. So did you end up having kids, or have you stayed in contact with either your law school, or it sounds like with SUNY?
CUNY.
Sorry.
Yes, well, yes, both. I have two sons. One works for a nonprofit and one's a second grade teacher. And the older one is married, and he has a daughter who's going to be 3 in September. So we're getting used to the grandparent part.
Are they around?
They both live in Brooklyn.
See? Okay.
I think they've inherited our idea of, staying clustered together. So, well, for a grandparent, that's good.
That's a good thing,
that's
right?
That's a good thing. And I run into law school people all the time because some of my law school classmates have populated jobs that allow me to run into them because they were very successful.
So would you like to teach, or are you still doing some not-for-profit work?
Well, I think of myself as a teacher. I've taught as an adjunct at NYU and Columbia and New York Law School. I'm currently I like the idea of teaching. Mostly I do it because I do it through interns. Mm-hmm. I try to get interns who are public interest oriented. We bring them in, show them how the court works. We bring in speakers and we tell them about opportunities. And I think we've probably had over 200 interns.
Oh, that's quite the organization. Well, your court's pretty organized on court outreach too.
Yes.
Yeah. So, are you involved in that?
I just participated in a program organized by our chief circuit judge, and we're bringing in high school teachers and talking about the Constitution. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the outreach and people just not seeing court as something strange and unusual. I think he has a great idea, and I think if more people really treated the courts as not just not as their only job being to, okay, my job is to decide this and that's it. As part of a community where if, for example, you have a bail decision and say somebody had mental illness, that ought to be something that you take into account. If somebody has a drug problem, that ought to be something you take into account, that the court is not separate and apart, but an integral facet of the community, concerned about its citizens, not just whether or not they should be bailed or not be bailed, but what's going to happen to them after that.
Well, we talked, when we were looking at judicial competencies, one of the words we couldn't agree on was empathy. And speaking of Justice Sotomayor, and how that's become kind of a code word for activist judging, but I think it is an attribute you would want judges to have, don't you?
I don't know how you can how you can do judging without empathy, and that's not sympathy. That's
right.
Not putting your finger on the scale. It means that I don't know how you settle cases if you don't really understand what's motivating people. I've had settlements in which, after listening to both sides, you find out that what's going to settle the case is not something that's apparent on the papers. And when you're able to feel what they're to understand what they're feeling, what motivates them, why are they here, that makes you better able to do your job. I had sort of a strange, or not strange case. I had one settlement in which when the person left, they wouldn't let him keep his old computer. And that's what set him off. I mean, there were other claims, but when we're talking to him, we found out that, everybody got to keep their computer, and it wasn't a security issue. They just were being
being dips about it.
And so we're talking, and I finally said, can he have the computer? And they said, sure. I said, well, why didn't you just let him keep the computer? But, if you don't understand the litigants, it seems to me difficult to do anything. If you don't understand people and their problems and what motivates them, it's difficult for you to mediate that, to be really an honest broker. Because if you're being an honest broker in life, you've got to know motivations. You got to know what makes people tick, and sometimes it's not the money. I mean, I have people sometimes they want apologies, and people feel disrespected. And that's empathy. That's because you understand what is motivating that person, what makes them sad, what makes them happy. And that's all empathy is. I mean, I don't know why people made empathy out to be such a bad word.
Well, it goes back to your original point about wanting people to be respected and wanting people to think that they can come to the courts as a legitimate place to solve a problem and not to have some answer imposed, but to be heard.
I have had probably as much success where we're having a conference, and pro se's, I think, present a significant problem for many people in the judiciary. And if you hear judges talk about it, you understand that it's not, judges aren't going either way, say, give me the pro se cases.
Right.
And pro se's are the kind of people who feel so disrespected that they feel enough to file a lawsuit. And sometimes if you can let them just tell you what the problem is, then that makes a difference. And it's the same on sometimes even on the criminal side. I had someone who on the criminal side I ran into later on, and the one thing they said to me, the whole time I was there, you were the first person who actually listened to me. And I didn't really remember the case.
No, but I think at being able to be in the courthouse and kind of set the tone, I think you can also help the clerk's office do a better job and the marshals and probation, because they see how you treat people and then they adopt that. So I mean, I think part of our job is to model good behavior about how you should treat litigants.
Well, I would say this. Every time I think of people who they're enamored by the position that people have, I think of the fact that I had parents who, common labor, domestic, those are not people who would have had jobs that people would say, oh, those are great jobs, congratulations. But those people did more than a lot of people who've got advanced degrees. They had 5 children, they raised those children, they instilled in them values, and that was important. And it's not who you are, but what you do at what you have. And that's the message they gave to us. And I think when you treat people who don't have degrees, they're not lawyers, they're not judges, then in many respects you're disrespecting the people who came before you. Because most of us came from generations in which people are getting better and better at the degrees. But the goodness, the worth, the value of those people, you're disrespecting them when you said, well, if you don't have a degree, if you're not a lawyer or a judge, then you're not worth as much. I believe those people were probably worth more, and they did more with less. And so I treat people as if all those people are part of a family. And it's not a question whether you're a Second Circuit judge or you're one of the staff in the cafeteria where I go, and like you say hello to everybody, you ask them how their day is, and that's what being part of the family is. And if you think that you're so great because you happen to be a judge, there's so many people who never get that opportunity. Instead of thinking that everything you're so great, you should be so thankful that in all the things that could happen to you, all the negative things, that you had people who got you to be an adult, and you had some success. So I think that I told one group of young people that the most difficult thing about being a judge is not letting all of the things that people say about you go to your head and think that you're just something special. It's a group of teenagers, and I said, because it's difficult, because people do treat you special, and you have to take a step back and understand that what makes you special isn't the title that you have, and that's.
Well, I think that's a pretty good observation, and I think that's a pretty good way to close our interview. And so thank you for coming, and I'm so glad that you changed your mind and jumped on the calendar, and that your friends said, no, you need to do this, and I'm glad we got the chance to talk.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, and I think it's good if we can have things that we can memorialize, because I think lost history and lost biographies and lost stories can never really be recovered, and so I think moving forward, it's good to look back. I wish people paid a lot more attention to history.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you.